Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Good afternoon to those of you in Europe, and good evening to those of you in the Far East, or Australia for that matter. I'm over that little flu bug. My voice is a little still raspy, but we can still talk about jazz, right? So, I'm turning 50 this summer. Not a number I'm thrilled about, but you don't really get to choose and pick your age. There's a certain humility that comes with mortality and with knowing your road isn't forever, which you don't really have that vision when you're 17. The naivete is kind of one of the great blessings of childhood. It's just that endless road that seems ahead of you. But as that road starts to narrow and gets a little darker out, these cats, uh, you just recognize, I don't know it all. I certainly don't understand all the purposes and meanings behind this walk of life. And I just hope that I've been a blessing to as many people as I can. And to those I've hurt over the years, you try to apologize to the cosmos, like I said in the last episode about the Tears for Fears. My wife turned around and bought me that record. I had already bought it for myself. I told her that too, but she bought me a copy. If someone's interested in buying it for me, I'll sell it for you at cost. If you want to pay the shipping and the cost of it, let me know. I guess it's kind of a first come, first served basis here. There's only one of them for sale. So if you're in Europe, you're probably better off buying it from the store to avoid the shipping costs. So I'm guessing I'll keep that to an American offer. So with my birthday, my wife's birthday coming up as well. She's turning 40 and I'm turning 50. She's turning 40 in 2 weeks. And we're going to go to Chicago to celebrate. And I'm actually hoping to hook up with my friend Scotty Baldwin when I'm there. Maybe do a little record shopping with him. And just, I don't know, me and Scott Baldwin could probably sit and talk jazz for hours until our wives are ready to choke us, I'm guessing. So we'll see how that goes. But maybe I'll even get a chance to interview him a little bit, which would be fun. The guy knows volumes of stuff. He's one of my go-tos when I have some questions along with Jean-Michel, Reeser, Beethoven, and a few other cats, that really know their stuff. But I'm honored to have friends like that in this great jazz kingdom. It's great to be seen by so many as a luminary and as a leading voice in the discussion of classic jazz. I'm honored by that. And a lot of people seem to see me as somebody that's got something to say and share and kind of a go-to guy for that era. And so this channel does have a place and a niche, and that's just a wonderful blessing that I'm very thrilled about. So I'm going to do a little 3-part series here on jazz greats from that era who died too young. And being that I'm almost 50, that's going to be our cutoff. And you might say, well, dying in your 40s isn't too young. Well, when you're 50, when you're 49, it seems too young to be passing away, I'll tell you that. And we lost some pretty great giant luminaries in jazz in their 40s. And it's definitely too young to be passing away. There's some surprising things in here. I think one of the most surprising things of all is how many jazz greats died from car crashes. It's quite an astounding thing to see how many there are. I think it speaks some to the safety of vehicles having gotten much safer in the passing decades. If you had a car crash in the 50s at 60 miles an hour, your chances of surviving were far less with how cars were built and the safety measures that were in place. We lost a lot of greats: car crashes, tuberculosis, cancer, alcoholism, drugs. There's a lot of things that took out a lot of our great jazz players. So we're going to start at at the age of 49. And we got 3 guys here that died at the age of 49. And all 3 guys I'm a huge fan of. We lost Gene Ammons to cancer. And Gene's one of the great tenor players, just a wonderful soul voice, blues, gospel, a lot of great records at Prestige. His dad also makes this list, who was one of the great piano players of the 30s and 40s. But Gene was just a fantastic player who I love dearly and have 30 some of his records at least. But we lost him at a pretty young age, and he, of course, struggled with drugs and alcohol. That's one of the things we're also going to see here, is that a lot of these people had a cause of death, but in parentheses, a lot of them had said alcohol and drugs contributed to these things. And so that's going to be a fairly ubiquitous thing, which, again, it's just a sad state of self medication for people that have struggled greatly, you know. And I don't need to dive into that. We all are pretty aware of that at this point. But so we lost Gene at 49. We lost the great Blue Mitchell at 49. And some of these guys you're not really aware of when they passed. Like my collection kind of really drops off a cliff, and after post 1970, I got the CTI discography. I have a lot of the great funk fusion stuff, R&B jazz from the 70s, but a lot of the more out there stuff I don't really haven't touched. Even a guy like Blue Mitchell, once he's done making his blue notes, I might even be missing his last few blue notes in the early 70s, I'm not sure. But he died from cancer at the age of 49. Blue Mitchell's one of the great trumpet players. If you like Donald Byrd, if you like Kenny Doram, Blue Mitchell's in that same vein. Blue Mitchell played for years with Horace Silver's great quintet after Horace Silver departed the Jazz Messengers. And Blues is a great, inspired player. He's very thoughtful and contemplative with his emoting, kind of like a Kenny Doram, like I said. Most of the great Blue Mitchell's work was at Riverside in the early 60s as a leader, and then he comes to Blue Note in the mid-60s and makes a string of great records there for Blue Note. You got to love Blue Mitchell. What a great contributor he was. Lester Young dies at 49, and Lester is one of the great voices of the second generation of jazz. Post New Orleans, he had obviously problems with liver disease from alcoholism. One of the great characters of jazz, personalities of jazz. He was nicknaming people left and right. And it's part of the black community, I think, a lot is the nickname Cats. And he called everyone Cats. Everyone nicknames. He also called people lady if you didn't know what your name was. Lester was just a character. He had the saxophone set off to the side when he played. Just a beautiful tone. A direct descendant of Coleman Hawkins. Kind of in between Hawkins and Ben Webster in terms of his sound. Hawkins is more mainstream, descendant into Rollins and Coltrane. Webster's more of that soft breathiness. And Webster has his own unique place in the canon in some ways. And Lester Young's kind of in the middle there with that soft, creamy tone. Not as breathy as Webster, not as sharp or as intense as some of the more full tone players of the saxophone. You have to love Lester with his pork pie hat, which of course Charles Mingus mentioned in the song he dedicated to him, Pork Pie Hat. You just gotta love Lester Young, one of the great giants of all time for sure. Moving on to 1948. In 48, we lose 4 guys, and this is by no means a comprehensive list. There's a lot of guys that died that either their names are kind of obscure or they come from a later era, or just I couldn't make it for everybody that I found. So I try to make it more of the preeminent names that people would recognize. Johnny Dodds dies in 1949. He had a heart attack. 48, sorry. Dodds was a great part of the early New Orleans sound and was a fantastic player. The cat's messing about up there. Dodds was a clarinetist, and he makes some pretty important recordings with a lot of the greats from that era. I think he was out of Texas, if memory serves correctly. Don't quote me on that. I think he was from the South for sure somewhere, though. And it's kind of amazing making my trading cards. Just how many guys were from Texas, Louisiana, Oklahoma. It's kind of way more than you think. That's for sure. Dodds was a great player. Kenny Doram, the aforementioned Kenny Doram, dies at the age of 48 from kidney disease. I'm not sure if kidney disease is all related to drinking. He doesn't seem like much of a partier because he seems like a very contemplative guy. But I love Kenny Doram's work. He's on numerous labels from New Jazz to Blue Note to Prestige Riverside. He's on a lot of different things. He's one of those guys that never really sat still or signed long-term contracts, it doesn't seem like. He makes a couple of great records for the Time label for Bob Shad out of New York. Those are both great records. That Showboat record's great. My phone just died on me. I can't remember the last time that happened. This new phone seems to hold a charge forever. But Kenny Doram, just a wonderful player. And most of his work on those labels in the 50s and 60s is well worth seeking out. His early Blue Note stuff's fantastic. He comes and goes from Blue Note a few times. One of the great trumpet players. Again, kind of a mid-range tone in terms of how his velocity and how hard he blows the trumpet. Also at 48, we have Hampton Halls, one of the great piano players. I don't think he was from the West Coast, but he ended up on the West Coast a long time. A lot of his recordings for contemporary are outstanding. He plays into the 60s and 70s. Just a great modern player who was pretty highly in demand for a while. And like I said, I know him best from his contemporary recordings. And Hampton Halls is a guy that shouldn't be overlooked. I think some people do overlook him. And then also at 48, we lost Tad Dameron. Tad Dameron was a great composer and arranger. We lost Hampton Halls to a brain hemorrhage, by the way, and also drugs. Kenny Doram, we lost to kidney disease. Tad Dameron, we lost to cancer. And Tad was an important orchestrator of the bebop, post-bebop movement, one of the great arrangers and composers of that time. He was pretty highly in demand to help put charts together, to help arrange big bands that had some bebop going on in them. Tad was very well respected. He works with guys like John Coltrane even, when Coltrane was much younger at Prestige. Tad was a very well, just sought after and well-respected voice in the community in jazz, and was a great loss when he passed away at the age of 48. At the age of 47, we lost the great Art Tatum. And for those of you who aren't a fan of Art Tatum or don't know Art Tatum, virtuosity has no rivals. This guy, his ability is just insane. The piano is his oyster. He just plays with it, tickles it, fancies it. It's delightful. Some of his runs and fills are just endlessly fluid, rhythmically precise, melodically interesting and intricate. Just flurries of sound. He spent most of his life mostly blind. He had a little vision of one eye, but he could hear something and replicate it on sight. He was that great. He held down a spot on 57th Street for quite a while in the 50s. I think he was originally from Toledo, Ohio, but he was fairly in demand for people who wanted the pianist to entertain people, didn't want to pay a full band. Tatum was that good. He could just entertain everybody by himself. Norman Granz at Verve does record him quite a lot. Columbia does record him quite a lot. Tatum's overlooked, and he's just a giant and a fantastic player. And when Parker first goes to New York, he's washing dishes at a place where Tatum is playing. And there's no question Tatum's playing is part of what brings Charlie Parker's bebop to fruition. Tatum's absolutely a link in that chain, as much as Coleman Hawkins' Body and Soul is a link in that chain. And Coleman was a clever guy. He always saw the changes. People talk about Miles and how Miles on the cutting edge. Miles was always kind of a few months to a year behind the cutting edge. Hawkins was, no matter how older he was than his peers, he was hearing the new sounds all the time. Hawkins was a brilliant man that way. At 47, we also lost the great Duke Pearson, who, to me, has two careers almost. He starts early at Blue Note in the mid-50s, makes a couple great records as a trio that I'm a huge fan of, Tender Moments and Profile. Beautiful records, just absolutely contemplative, melancholic, gorgeous piano trios. Ike Quebec, the A&R guy at Blue Note, passes away, sadly, who we'll talk about coming up. And Duke Pearson takes on that role, becoming a talent scout, an A&R producer, helping pick who the sidemen are going to be, how we're going to produce each record and each session, what kind of sounds we're looking for. He was great at doing that kind of arranging and production value. He spends quite a lot of time filling those shoes at Blue Note, starts recording his own records again. And when you listen to stuff like Wahoo, they're quite different than his earlier piano trio stuff. His earlier piano trio stuff is quite accessible, and almost anybody can listen to those records and enjoy them. These later records have much bigger bands, to the point where he has actually a big band at times, playing kind of a modern mix, a hard bop big band almost. It's great stuff. So there's very different sounds that Pearson was capable of. He does some recordings for Atlantic. He makes a cool record for Jazz Line label, a little small label. Pearson's work is pretty sought after, and I think I've always promoted his stuff quite a lot. So I know a lot of people on this channel are fairly familiar with Duke Pearson, I hope. And we lost him to multiple sclerosis, which I think is the only cat we lose to that in this list. At the age of 46, we lost the great Cannonball Adderley. And we lost Cannonball to cerebral hemorrhage. And again, drugs and alcohol were in parentheses. He also his weight was an issue, so there's probably some diabetic issues going on there. Cannonball doesn't need too much of introduction. Out of Tampa, Florida. His work in New York when he comes up north in 54, 55. First at Savoy, and then in Chicago with the Emerson label. It's some of the defining moments of hard bop as it's coming into its own shoes, as it were. And him and his brother Nat were great proponents of a lot of what's happening in the late 50s. Everyone kind of knows something else with Miles Davis at Blue Note, but Adderley's career is speckled with brilliant recordings. His stuff at Riverside is outstanding. You can't really go wrong with Adderley's work from 55 to about 65. He eventually signs with Capitol and gets a nice payday out of that. And he still makes good records, but they're much more accessible, commercial, selling to the major white America kind of markets. So they're still good records, but they don't have quite the guts and the ferocity of some of Cannonball's early work. One of the great alto players of all time, though. So we lost Cannonball at 46. At the age of 45, we lost two of the greats. We lost Nat Cole, who people think too much of it just as unforgettable. He's just a crooner. But he was one of the great jazz pianists. I've told the story before about him and Oscar Peterson were two of the leading pianists at the time in the 40s. And Nat started singing. So Oscar started to do some singing. And when Nat heard Oscar singing, by the way, that Oscar Peterson sings record 10-inch, that's outstanding stuff. But when Nat hears Oscar singing, he kind of has a proposition for Oscar. He's like, Oscar, you stick to the piano playing, I'll stick to the singing, and never the two shall meet. And Oscar honors that until Nat Cole dies. And when Nat dies, he makes a record honoring Nat Cole. Nat's a great player. His early work in trios was pretty outstanding stuff. The great Oscar Moore plays guitar with him on some of those records. It was just outstanding. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think it's Oscar Moore. My mind gets jumbled at times. Starting to lose my memory as I get older. Things aren't quite as crisp. At 45, we also lost the great Wes Montgomery. Native of St. Louis, if I recall. He ends up first on the West Coast, working with his brothers on the Master Sounds. His buddies Bunk and Monk Montgomery. One played vibes, one played the bass. They had some great records on Pacific. Made some great music, a couple of fantasy records. Then Wes moves back out east and starts working with Riverside. And Wes's greatest records are definitely at Riverside. And then Wes moves to Verve. And he makes some really popular records for Verve. And they're jazz pop. You know, you hear him doing California Dreamin' and Tequila and some of those songs. They're definitely kind of a jazz pop. But the guy had like 9 kids or something. So when you have bills to pay, make that money, Wes. But from every guitar player I've ever known who has any knowledge of jazz guitar, Wes is the guy. Everyone says so. And I have a great appreciation for Wes. I just can't speak of it from a guitar virtuoso standpoint. But when you listen to him, you can hear he's doing different chord phrasing and inverted chords and just doing stuff that guys like Grant Green don't do. Grant Green plays bebop, kind of single note lines that are just like a horn. He's just playing with single notes, up and down, playing scales, and I love Grant Green, but Wes Montgomery has a lot of different colors and palettes with which he paints. And we lost Wes to a heart attack sometime in the late 60s, 69 or 70 or so. At the age of 44, we lost quite a few people here at the age of 44, starting with the great Billie Holiday. And Billie died from heart attack and liver disease, and alcohol and drugs were huge factors for Billie Holiday. I believe she was a Baltimore native, and she had a very trying life from singing in brothels as a young girl to being a prostitute herself, actually being a pimp at times. She was dangerous. She was a tough bird that didn't take no messing from nobody. And she went on tour with Artie Shaw. She was asked to take the freight elevator because the white guests were complaining about this black lady riding in the regular elevator with the white folks. And Artie came to her kind of meekly and said, the hotel's asked me to ask you to ride in the freight elevator. And Billie just said, I can't. I quit. Her pride her humanity wasn't going to allow that indignation. And good for her. She ended up not touring much of her later life. And because of her drug duress and problems, she couldn't play a lot in a lot of places as well. So she loved New York, but she couldn't play in some places because of her cabaret license being revoked. So she ends up doing quite a bit of recording for Norman Granz in the 50s, Columbia in the 40s. Powerful young singer in the 40s, and a very emotional singer in the 50s. Two different gals almost. But what a sad sorrow, and no one inflects themselves on the piece quite like Billie Holiday is this side of Louis Armstrong. Armstrong could take any song and make it a Louis Armstrong song. Billie Holiday could take any lyric and make it come from her point of view. And sometimes it's just a simple inflection, a simple shifting of a few words, but Holiday has this magical ability to make everything feel very personal and first-hand experience. So you have to love Billie Holiday. If you don't, I don't know what you're doing. Don't know what planet you're from. We lost Woody Shaw, one of the great trumpet players. It was as side effects from a train accident. He got hit by a train, believe it or not. I'm guessing in New York, but maybe a subway. I don't really know the details, but the side effects and complications from that would led him to passing away shortly after that. He was a young guy, 44, Woody Shaw, one of the fiery young trumpet players that came up in the 60s. As I've talked to you guys before, in the 60s, there was a real shortage of new young trumpet players. Most of the greats come up in the late 50s, early 50s, 40s. You know, Lee Morgan, Booker Little. That's kind of that last wave of great trumpet players. And then in the 60s, not a lot of new trumpet players show up. It becomes saxophones, guitars, and organs that all the new musicians are. Woody Shaw is one of the great exceptions to that. He shows up on the scene in late Blue Note as a sideman, and then he makes a lot of great records as a leader going into the 70s and 80s. I only have a couple of them because I don't collect that era very much. But when I hear him as a sideman on Blue Note or watch him on YouTube, what a dynamic player. And on par with Clifford Brown and with Freddie Hubbard. Just a talent to be really taken seriously. And he's someone I plan on delving into more once I start buying records again and have the income to do so. I'd like to get Blackstone Legacy, but that record's gotten very expensive. Reissue, put that one out. We also lost Ike Quebec at the age of 44, lung cancer and drugs. And Ike Quebec, as I mentioned with the Duke Pearson, was an A&R guy for Blue Note. He does some R&B kind of sounding sides for Blue Note in the 40s, early 50s. There's 7 inches for the most part. And then Blue Note doesn't record him for a good while. He kind of slips in the A&R role. And he kind of is pressing Alfred Lion and say, hey, can I make another record? I feel like I can still be contemporary with these kids here. And they were hesitant. They were like, oh, we're not sure. Like, you're kind of from a different era, different sound. You know, more of the Tiny Bradshaw R&B sounds that were going on. That was kind of innovative and young and fresh, but probably not what Alfred Lion really wanted. But he finally gets his way, recording Heavy Soul, and It Might As Well Be Spring. Some of these great records in 60, 61. His Bossa Nova record. Outstanding stuff. I love Quebec. He's a very meditative, again, very melancholic player. That tends to be my anchorage. That's where I want to be with my tenor saxophonist. He's got definitely some Ben Webster in him, some Lester Young in him. Great lineage to be a part of, and I'm a huge fan of Ike Quebec. And he's one of the first Blue Note cats that was a little bit deeper of an artist that I really fell in love with. I loved Ike Quebec, and I have for 20 years. Also, at the age of 44, we lost Freddie Kepper. Freddie Kepper is one of the most underappreciated players in jazz. There's not a ton of recordings out there that you can go out and buy, collect on a regular basis. There is some, but he kind of is that in between of King Oliver and Louis Armstrong. You have Buddy Bolden before Oliver, and Bolden was the New Orleans legend who kind of, most say, invented jazz. Nothing exists of his career or his recordings that has ever been found to this date. Along comes King Oliver and Freddie Kepper, two kind of very different personalities and two very different players in a way. But Kepper, most people in New Orleans at that time picked one camp or the other. as to who was the greatest. But it was definitely a 50-50 split. These guys both kind of, and people both said you could hear either guy from blocks away. And Kepper would just have people following around town in New Orleans. They march and play. And Kepper was just a legend. He struggled with some drugs and stuff, alcohol as well. He died from tuberculosis and alcohol abuse. And kind of his legacy really slipped into obscurity, which is kind of sad because he was one of the great early voices and one of the great early talents. And we lost him at the age of 44. The great Herbie Nichols, who was of Trinidadian descent. I think he was actually born in New York, but his parents were Trinidadian. Herbie Nichols is a fantastic pianist, intricate, delicate, a lot of Monk spacing and contemplative runs and flurries and fills and an open room. Nichols kind of belongs in that conversation with Bud Powell, Elmo Hope, Thelonious Monk. He's one of those guys that was really one of the great New York pianists that helped push the envelope. And the pianists have a separate place in jazz. They're very much stars in and of their own right. If you're a sax player, you need a band. If you're a pianist, you have an orchestra at your fingertips. And so a lot of Elmo Hope, a lot of Bud Powell, a lot of Monk, a lot of Kirby Nichols stuff will be trio, sometimes even solo. But they're such great players and so inventive that they'll just be so interesting and compelling to listen to on a regular basis. I'm a huge Herbie Nichols guy. Most of his work is going to be at Blue Note, 10-inch era, into the early 1500 series where he has a record there as well. And then last, at the age of 44, we lost the great Joe Harriott, who was born in Jamaica, immigrates to London, and was a big part of the UK jazz scene. He kind of comes from a hard bop school initially, bebop, really initially, into hard bop. But by the early 60s, he's kind of embracing Ornette Coleman and the sounds of free jazz. And he makes some great records on the Jazzland Riverside label that are very cutting edge and very avant-garde with a lot of interesting tonality and shape and direction. And again, he dies very young at the age of 44. We lost Joe Harriott way too soon. Moving on to the age of 43. A lot of greats here at the age of 43, guys. Oliver Nelson, the great sax players of the 50s. Does some great work at Argo, at Prestige. And then as he moved into the 60s, he becomes one of the leading arrangers and composers for the pop side of jazz at Impulse and at Verve. And he's doing just some great work, bringing horn arrangements in, bringing string arrangements in, and keeping the blues and the jazz undercurring all of that. Oliver's just an interesting player that as the 70s dawned, he was really starting to work in films and soundscapes and soundtracks. And he seemed like he had quite a career being carved out for him. Sadly, we lost him to a heart attack early in the 70s. Oliver Nelson was a great talent. Elmo Hope, as we just mentioned, drugs and a heart failure. Elmo was again part of that New York piano scene. Elmo has some great recordings at Prestige and at Blue Note. His Informal Jazz record at Prestige is one of the great hidden hard bop gems of that era. It gets reissued as 2 tenors much later by Prestige. His work at Blue Note, 10-inch stuff mostly, is fantastic. Elmo's again one of those really great contemplative players, like I said, with Nichols and Monk and Powell. He spent some time in jail. We lost Elmo Hope way too young. I'm a huge Elmo Hope guy. He has some great records at Riverside too, 2 or maybe 3 even. And I think one of them's with his wife accompanying him. You gotta love Elmo Hope, just like you gotta love Herbie Nichols. Bud Powell, 43. We lost him at the age of 43. And Bud Powell is one of the most tragic stories in jazz. Tuberculosis and alcohol were again a leading factor here. So tuberculosis keeps appearing here a lot in the 30s and the 40s into the 50s. Bud Powell is one of the most tragic stories in jazz, from being beat up by police, being sent to mental institutions, being electrically shock therapied. It breaks down his psyche. It breaks the fear, the panic, the anxiety. It became omnipresent in his life. His early recordings are just incredible at Blue Note and other places as well, Mercury Clef. He ends up going to Europe for a while, and I think he found some more serenity there, not being in the face of the racist monster that we live here in America. But a lot of the damage had already been done. And he ends up institutionalized at several different times. And they strip so much of his humanity away. And he's still making recordings towards the end of his life that always show some elements of his brilliance. He's not quite the Art Tatum-inspired virtuoso in his later years. He becomes a bit more monkish, actually, with his spatial openings and his contemplative. I think he lost some of that dexterity, though, through all the abuse and sadness that is the Bud Powell story. What a tragedy. And truly, it's one of the saddest stories in jazz. If you read about Bud Powell and you don't tear up a little bit, you're not really reading very closely. Really sad story by truly one of the great players in jazz. He should be there with Parker and Monk and all those greats. Powell is a huge player, and yet Powell's discography is sadly quite overlooked. His records go for a fraction of what a lot of other records on those labels go for. And if you ask a lot of jazz greats who the most important players are, who the greatest piano players are, Bud Powell was on the tip of a lot of people's tongues in those days. Powell was a very innovative, powerful presence in the jazz canon, and he's just kind of slipped, sadly, way too much into obscurity. It's heartbreaking on some levels. Bessie Smith, the great Bessie Smith, just a legend of the 30s and the 40s as a great singer. The blues, the jazz, the attitude, the gospel. She is the Black experience personified. She puts it all into the microphone with an austere kind of, this is what you get. Too bad you don't like it. There's a brashness and in-your-faceness and unapologeticness that makes Bessie Smith special. Her narration and storytelling is top of the mark. She's as much of a character as a Louis Armstrong in some ways. And she's one of those cats that really did cross over into white America early on. Her storytelling and her power and her personality just seemed to transcend, even though she was unapologetically Black. She was really quite a character. And we lost her to a car crash, sadly, at the age of 43. The great Django Reinhardt, one of the great guitarists of all time, a Belgian native, spent a lot of his time in Paris with the Hot Club of Paris, along with Stefan Grappelli. He played with a lot with the American players when they came to Europe. He was of Romani descent, being somewhat of a gypsy. He lost some fingers. Was it polio maybe? There was some issue with some of his fingers. But he was still one of the most intricate and incredible players, and he changes the face of jazz and jazz guitar. Just a real impactful guy. There's not really a great way to describe his music. I've heard it called gypsy jazz. That's offensive to some people, especially now with today's politically correct, uptight bunch of humans that we live with. But it does have a certain cafe, Parisian, cafe on the Seine with an umbrella for the sun, a sun umbrella. Like you could have a sun umbrella and a Vespa listening to Django Reinhardt. It's atmospheric, it's moody. It has this scenic, pastoral, Parisian feel to it that few other things quite embody like he does. He came to America, I think, and toured for a little bit, and he passed away really young, the age of 44, afraid of 43 from a brain hemorrhage. And what a loss the great Django Reinhardt was. We lost Bill Hardman to kind of a mysterious illness. He fell sick, spent some time in the hospital, never really recovered, and passed away shortly after. Hardman was a great trumpet player, in the bebop into the hard bop school. His recording at Savoy is absolutely just a great record. He does some great work with numerous other players, including with the Jazz Messengers for a time in '57. You got to love Bill Hardman, and he dies, like I said, from quite a mysterious illness. And then last of all, at the age of 43, we lost Grant Green, who was probably 1971 or 72 he passes. And Grant's one of the great bebop guitar players. Those single note lines that he plays are long and woven, emulating Parker, emulating a horn player. He's not much one for setting up chords and playing rhythms. He was a lead guitarist in a lot of essence. He wasn't Freddie Green. He was Grant Green. And I love Grant Green's body of work. It's been kind of enhanced by the Blue Note reputation. So his records are probably fetching more than they would if he was at Riverside. But that's not his fault. His records are very much in demand at this point. He, in the 60s, goes very much into a soul jazz. boogaloo with blues, and the gospel roots always omnipresent. He'll do spirituals and black Negro songs and church music and the blues, and it's all woven into the fabric of what Grant Green is. A lot of his work is with organ players and a drummer, so it's just a simple organ, bass, and organ, the drummer and Grant filling, playing. He moves into kind of more of a funkier sound, the late 60s, early 70s, struggling with heroin, sadly. He was dismissed from Blue Note for a while, actually came back. He makes a record for Kudu in the early 70s that's actually really quite outstanding, funky fusion crossover. He had died from a heart attack, and again, drugs and heroin were a leading proponent in Grant Green's loss. And I'm a huge Grant Green fan. We lost him at the age of 43. The age of 42, we lose Tina Brooks to kidney failure. Tina Brooks, again, was a drug habit guy. He came to Blue Note. If I remember, he's out of Pittsburgh, I think. And he comes to Blue Note, Alfred Lyon's attention, and he signs him. His first record comes out at the same time as Freddie Hubbard's first record. And they actually appear on each other's records, and they both are released on the same day. And the Hubbard record just took off. The Tina Brooks record never really did, which meant a couple other sessions that Tina Brooks recorded didn't get issued. So they're not part of the classic Blue Note canon. But Back to the Tracks, The Waiting Game, and Minor Move, is it? Those records all come out in posterity. And of course, Tone Poets issued all of them now. Sonny Clark's had a lot of those sessions. Outstanding hard bop. A very evocative player with a lot to say. Just who never had success. He never had popularity to create more demand for his sessions. And sadly, he dies much too young at the age of 42. The great Ray Draper, the great tuba player of the hard bop era in jazz. There was players who played the tuba in the swing era. Rod Callender plays bass and tuba, some in the 50s. But in the 60s, it was Ray Draper. Late 50s, even at Prestige, he's working with Jackie McLean. He comes to working with John Coltrane some on the Jubilee label. And he comes back to Prestige New Jazz and does a record with Coltrane again. Quite a dexterous player, considering he's playing a tuba. Not a record that lends itself to dexterous playing, but he had that ability. He also had a bad drug habit. He ends up spending most of the 60s in jail. And sadness just follows this guy's life. He gets released from jail and makes one of the first real fusion funk jazz records called Red Beans and Rice with a whole new band. And he probably wasn't the best people person, it sounds like. And he ends up firing a few band members. And I can't remember exactly the details, but he ends up being murdered. And I think it was something to do with a drug deal and some resentment from one of the musicians. And I got to read again what it was, but it's kind of a shocking end to a guy that's kind of been forgotten. But he was definitely murdered. And Ray Draper, his records are collectible and tough to find, especially those New Jazz Prestige titles. The Jubilee one's pretty tough to come by as well. And that Red Beans and Rice on Epic, you can find that pretty easy. And it's actually a really solid record with vocals sounding like some later George Benson or Donald Byrd. You know, it's got that later 70s vibe to it in 68. Ahead of Bitches Brew. You know, that's one of the things you'll find when you read on that record. This record predates most of the fusion R&B crossover stuff that happens. So you gotta love Ray Draper. Rashawn Roland Kirk has a stroke at the age of 42. Rashawn Roland Kirk's first recordings were at King. He makes some other recordings for a lot of different labels, from Mercury to Prestige. He's on New Atlantic. He's on numerous different labels. He is blind and plays 2 or 3 horns at the same time. So he actually most horn players can only play single notes. Because he's playing multiple horns, he can create chords. Play the 1, the 3, and the 5th, or the 1, the 5, and the 7. So he can make these chords that create sounds and textures and tones that you don't get from horns very often unless you have 3 horn players. And it's hard to have 3 horn players play in unison as often or as well as one guy doing it himself. Kirk was a very innovative guy. He kind of tackles some of the avant-garde and some of the edges at times, but always stays rooted in the blues and the black church. I guess he was quite a phenomenon live as well, talking to his audience, and I guess he was quite an animated player. I love Kirk. I need to dig into him more. I have probably 15 of his records. There's some stuff on Mercury I still need to collect. I love Kirk. Way too sad. Way too early a loss. Jimmy Garrison. Here's a guy that backed Coltrane and was part of the great Coltrane quartet for longer than anybody. He stuck by Coltrane through thick and thin. He comes to Coltrane probably in 60 or 61, and he's with Coltrane on a lot of those early stuff. I think he's on Africa Brass, if I remember. Not positive, but he's definitely on all the great Coltrane stuff. And even after McCoy Tyner departs and Elvin Jones departs, Jimmy Garrison stays on. Yeah, I think they even bring on a second bass player, if memory serves, but Garrison's still there doing what he does. He seemed like he was very much into the avant-garde, and I think he must have loved John Coltrane a great deal. And he makes a record with Elvin Jones at Impulse. It's very collectible, very tough to find. But again, we lost Jimmy Garrison really young at the age of 42. And then we lost Albert Ammons at the age of 42 from natural causes. The great boogie woogie stride piano player from the Midwest. Again, Gene Ammons is his son. And he just passed away young at the age of 42. I'm not sure if I mentioned Jimmy Garrison died from lung cancer. But at the age of 41, I didn't find nobody in my list. No one seemed to die at 41. So if you want to get famous as a jazz player, die when you're 41. At the age of 40, we got 3 more guys here for this episode. Glenn Miller. You might say he's not jazz, but he is. He was very accessible, very loved by white audiences and listeners. He had played some with Goodman. He had really earned his chops. And he's in the Tommy Dorsey, Jimmy Dorsey school, very popular. And his band that he put together in the late 30s churns out a number of chart-dominating hits. Really popular stuff. And I'm a big fan of some of those tracks. They're really fun. And they're saccharine to some degree. They're accessible. White America loved them. They swing harder than you think they do. And you got to love Glenn Miller. He was one of the biggest selling artists of that time. And he signed up for the war. And he wants to play for the troops in Europe. He goes over to England. And then they fly him across the channel to join the front lines and play. And his plane goes missing over the English Channel. And so we lost Glenn Miller at the age of 40. He was never found. And whether it was a plane malfunction or the Luftwaffe shooting him down, we don't know. His music lives on. Pennsylvania, 65000, whatever it is. Moonlight, all those songs are just fantastic. I Met a Gal in Kalamazoo. I love that song. Talk about vocal dexterity. Those guys are playing. And what's the Ted Beneke, is it? The sax singer guy? Outstanding. What a talent those guys were. And it just speaks to the volume how different white America, black America are and how they want to show their great ability. You know, it just comes less bluesy, less soulful, the white players, but equally talented, equally able to play incredible music. It just feels it's from a different place. That gal from Kalamazoo doesn't feel like the blues. It feels like apple pie, as it should, because that's where it comes from. And so it's very honest. Dino Washington, one of the great blues, R&B, jazz singers of the early 40s into the 50s, makes a string of incredible records for MRC. All those records are just outstanding records. Just a real talent, a real guttural gospel shout. The blues drips off of her. Just attitude. Some Bessie Smith lives in Dino Washington, a great singer. Sadly, she dies in her bed from an accidental overdose, laying next to her 7th husband, Dick Night Train Lane, who was a professional football player for the Detroit Lions. He played for the Bears as well. So she's laying in bed next to her pro football husband, and she passes away from an accidental overdose. I didn't realize that she died that young until I was making my trading cards last month. I'm like, oh, wow, that's a sad story. So we lost Dinah way too young. And then last but not least, at the age of 40, we lost the great John Coltrane. And Coltrane's legacy is synonymous with jazz in the 60s. You know, his trip through in the late 40s and early 50s, he's ascending to go where he went. But he's not really there in the 50s. He's on his way there. And of course the stuff with Miles Davis is pretty outstanding. But like even Miles talked about how he didn't know how to put his horn down. sometimes Miles would just leave the stage, and Coltrane would go until someone kind of kicked him in the shin and said, "Hey, dude, shut up." But Coltrane had such a passion and a connection with his horn. It was an extension of his body. Some people who knew him well said he played all day nonstop, practicing, rehearsing. Ideas would come to him in the middle of the night. He'd get up and play. And his recording career reflects that. I have 70 some records of Coltrane from a 10-year career, and that's not including his work as a sideman, which is also fairly impressive in the 50s. He doesn't do any side work in the 60s, of course, because by then he's a pretty big name. One of the best paid jazz players in the 60s, probably second to Miles, probably at Impulse. I think Impulse got more than they bargained for when they signed him. And I think Impulse was thinking, oh man, he's going to be playing my favorite things and making us hits. And Coltrane was done with that. He'd wanted to move on. But they still had to make ballads and the Johnny Hartman record and the Duke Ellington record. So there's some very accessible Coltrane to be had in the 60s. But then he really pushes the boundaries out to the edges of the solar system and starts diving into the cosmos and the spirituality that's broader than one religion. All religions encompass what Coltrane speaks of. He wants to get to the root of the thing. And he's just a powerful player. He struggled with liver cancer, and his hepatitis, some people suggest, might have been an issue. His health starts failing 64, 65, which I think creates an urgency in him, which escalates his intensity, which escalates his need to try different things to get it all out of him. And I think no player in the jazz canon is more likely to have come back to his roots than Coltrane. I think Coltrane would have ended up back playing the blues, back playing soul and gospel jazz, because it just seemed to be the trajectory that his soulful path was taking him. But what a great loss, Coltrane at the age of 40, 1967. Just a real tragedy. So that is the guys we lost that are prominent names to my interests in their 40s. Stay tuned for the next episode, where we'll dive into a bunch of players who passed away in their 30s. And it's quite a list as well. And then in part three, we'll dive into guys who died in their 20s. And that's a sad list. Those guys who died in their 20s, man. That's some amazing players. If you enjoy this channel, please hit the subscribe button and the like button. Hit the bell for updates. And if you want to help support the channel, please go to my Patreon page and pledge a monthly small little donation. Or you can go to my merchandise store and buy some great Jazz Shepherd merchandise, including stuff for the upcoming Jazz Shepherd coffee shop, which we're slowly getting that together. It's been kind of a crazy last few months for our family. But my wife's now a 911 operator, and that was a pretty intensive training for the last few months. So kind of sidetracked some things, but we're getting back on track now, and she's through her training period now. So prayers for everyone, prayers for people in Ukraine, prayers for everyone who's struggling anywhere, with natural disasters and what's going on in the world today. It's a crazy place. Everyone be safe, stay healthy, be smart. Don't believe everything you hear. Don't believe half of what you see. And trust your heart. Trust that voice inside of you. If it's saying to you that doesn't make sense, something's wrong, it probably is. Because when you look back in history, almost everything I've tried to believe in has proven to be lies. And so it's okay to question and not believe everything you're told. Trust me. Be safe again. Like I said, here's to turning 50 this summer. So cheers, guys. Be blessed. We'll talk to you soon.